Welcome to One Woman, No Vote, a conversation on journalism, justice, and the 19th Amendment. My name is Channing Joseph, and I'm a lecturer of journalism here at USC Annenberg. Dr. Allissa Richardson, our moderator, has asked me to open the event by saying a few words about the role of allyship and intersectionality in the long fight for equal voting rights in the United States. And it's my pleasure to do so. 100 years ago today, the 19th Amendment to the US Constitution was ratified, promising that US citizens would no longer be denied the right to vote on account of sex. It was a lie. As we know, not all women in the United States would reap the benefits of suffrage equally. And I am sad to say that too often journalists don't know our own profession's role in this history. Let's take Ida B. Wells, for example. Wells was a Black investigative journalist born into slavery in 1862. While advocating for women's right to vote, she also reported on the extrajudicial killings of Black men and women in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Yet Black women like herself were prevented from voting by the same racial terrorism. The white male journalist Horace Greeley, editor of the New York Tribune in the 19th century, ridiculed the early suffragists as men with female physiques. Yet other male journalists like the great Frederick Douglass, editor of several newspapers throughout his life, was one of the very few men, Black or otherwise, who vocally supported women's right to vote in the 19th century. There's a section of Wells' autobiography that speaks to the importance of allyship. In it, Wells tells the story of how she was once invited to be a guest in the home of the white suffragist, Susan B. Anthony. While staying there, Wells was confronted several times by racist affronts. In one memorable instance, Anthony offered Wells the services of her stenographer, Miss Willard. Here's Wells writing in her own words. "When I went upstairs to my room, I waited for the stenographer to come in. When she did not do so, I concluded that she didn't find it convenient and went on writing my letters longhand. When Miss Anthony returned, she came to my room and found me busily engaged. 'You didn't care to use my secretary, I suppose? I told her to come to your room when you came upstairs. Didn't she come?' I said no. She said no more, but turned and went into her office. Within 10 minutes, she was back again in my room. The door being open, she walked in and said, 'Well, she's gone.' And I said, 'Who?' She said, 'The stenographer.' I said, 'Gone where?' 'Why,' she said, 'I went into the office and said to her, "You didn't tell Miss Wells what I said about writing some letters for her." The girl said, "No, I didn't." 'Well, why not?' Then the girl said, "It is all right for you, Miss Anthony, to treat Negroes as equals, but I refuse to take dictation from a colored woman." 'Indeed,' said Miss Anthony. 'Then you needn't take any more dictation from me. Miss Wells is my guest, and any insult to her is an insult to me. So if that is the way you feel about it, you needn't stay any longer.' Miss Anthony said the girl sat there without moving, whereupon she said, 'Come get your bonnet and go,' and the girl got up and went. Miss Anthony tells about this incident in the history of her own life so that you can see it was not a Star Chamber proceeding. She added that she supposed she too belonged to Miss Willard's class, for she had done that very same thing in the Women's Equal Suffrage Association. She said when women called their first convention back in 1848, inviting all those who thought that women ought to have an equal share with men in the government, Frederick Douglass, the ex-slave, was the only man who came to their convention and stood up with them. He said he could not do otherwise, that we were among the friends who fought his battles when he first came among us, appealing for our interest in the anti-slavery cause. From that day until the day of his death, Frederick Douglass was an honorary member of the National Women's Suffrage Association. In all our conventions, most of which had been held in Washington, he was the honored guest who sat on our platform and spoke in our gatherings. But when the Equal Suffrage Association went to Atlanta, Georgia, knowing the feeling of the South with regard to Negro participation on equality with whites, I myself asked Mr. Douglass not to come. I did not want to subject him to humiliation, and I did not want anything to get in the way of bringing the Southern white women into our suffrage association, now that their interest had been awakened. Not only that, said Miss Anthony, but when a group of colored women came and asked that I come to them and aid them in forming a branch of the Suffrage Association among the colored women, I declined to do so. on the ground of that same expediency. And you think I was wrong in doing so? She asked of Wells. I answered uncompromisingly yes, said Wells, for I felt that although she may have made gains for suffrage, she had also confirmed white women in their attitude of segregation. I suppose Miss Anthony had pity on my youth and inexperience, for she never in any way showed resentment of my attitude. She gave me rather the impression of a woman who was eager to hear all sides of any question, and that I am sure is one of the reasons for her splendid success in the organization, which did so much to give the women of this country an equal share in all the privileges of citizenship. Such a dear, good friend I found her to be, and she had many such like her there in Rochester. The words of the great Ida B. Wells. Now it is my honor to introduce our moderator for this afternoon's panel, Dr. Allissa B. Richardson, Assistant Professor of Journalism and Communication at USC Annenberg, one of the nation's leading experts on mobile journalism, and the author of the best-selling new book, Bearing Witness While Black, African Americans, Smartphones, and the New Protest Journalism.
Thank you for the introduction, Professor Joseph. It grounded us so well. And thank you, viewers, for tuning into our centennial celebration of the passing of the 19th Amendment. And for today's event, One Woman, One Vote, I'm joined by a really distinguished panel of scholars whose expertise range in areas of feminist studies, legal analysis, the history of voting in America, and because we are the Annenberg School, the role of the press in furthering the suffragette movement in the U.S. This is a really momentous time to have this conversation, considering that earlier this month, on August 6th, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 turned 55 years old. On July 17th, one of the act's key architects and advocates, Congressman John Lewis, passed away, and fellow civil rights icon C.T. Vivian died on the same day. But many have said, especially on Black Twitter, that their simultaneous transition from elders to ancestors symbolized that they were passing the torch to the next generation. Last week, we got a glimpse of what that next generation might look like. Presidential hopeful Joe Biden selected Senator Kamala Harris to be his running mate. This historic decision situates the conversation we're going to have today. It's really an examination of this spectrum of women's suffrage along many, many years of struggle. And all groups of women did not gain this right at the same time. And so today, without further ado, to kind of unpack what this centennial celebration means, I'm going to be joined by many, many scholars who have incredible insight into this. So please help me welcome Dr. Francille Wilson, Associate Professor of American Studies in Ethnicity and History at the University of Southern California. Her research examines the intersections between Black labor movements, Black social scientists, and Black women's history during the Jim Crow era. Her book, The Segregated Scholars, Black Social Scientists, and the Creation of Black Labor Studies from 1890 to 1950, was awarded the Letitia Woods Brown Memorial Prize for the best book in African American women's history by the Association of Black Women Historians. Dr. Sarah Banet-Weiser is Professor of Media and Communications and head of the Department of Media and Communication at the London School of Economics. Her research interests include gender in the media, identity, citizenship and cultural politics, consumer culture and popular media, race in the media, and intersectional feminism. She is the author of Empowered, Popular Feminism and Popular Misogyny. Dr. Ariela Gross is the John B. and Alice R. Sharp Professor of Law and History in the USC Gould School of Law. Her research and writing focus on race and slavery in the United States and how the law has been used to shape and reinforce racism here in America. She's the co-author of the best-selling new book, Becoming Free, Becoming Black, Race, Freedom, and Law in Cuba, Virginia, and Louisiana. And Dr. Mindy S. Romero is the Research Assistant Professor and founder and director of the California Civic Engagement Project at USC, at the Price School of Public Policy in Sacramento. Her research focuses on political behavior and race, ethnicity, and seeks to explain patterns of voting and political underrepresentation, particularly among youth and communities of color in California and the US. So as you can see, we have an incredible powerhouse of expertise here on this panel. And I really want to dig in today with all of you what we should think about when we think about this 100-year celebration. For many of you, it means different things according to what you study. And so I want to start with you, Dr. Wilson, and ask you, I've heard you speak often about Black women who've lived in the 19th and early 20th century fighting two fights, one against Jim Crow and another for women's suffrage. We hear that language now as we talk about fighting the dual fights of this COVID-19 pandemic, as well as police brutality. And I'm wondering if you might anchor us a bit and tell us what those two fights have looked like for Black women who endeavored to vote, and why Black women may be looking at this celebration a bit differently today.
Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Richardson, and thank you for everyone who's attending and my esteemed panelists. I think for Black American women, it's not just the late 19th and early 20th century, but the struggle for suffrage has always been a struggle, not just for women's suffrage, but for African American suffrage in general. So just as the white women that we know as the early suffragists came out of the abolition movement, we know a little bit less about the hundreds of Black women who were abolitionists. We know about Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman, but we don't know very much about the journalist Mary Ann Shadd Cary, who led hundreds of Black people out of the US to Canada in the 1850s and started the Provincial Freeman newspaper, and then later became one of the first Black women to get a law degree in the United States. So this idea that Black people should be full citizens is something that Black women have worked for, and we heard the important words of Ida B. Wells, who was another journalist. And then at the same time that Ida B. Wells was beginning to wind down her fight, Carlotta Bass became the editor of the California Eagle in 1913. And, we know that she also was actually one of the first Black women to be named as a vice presidential candidate when she ran with Vincent Hallinan on the Progressive Party ticket in 1952. And so if we think about her struggle and all of these women, Gertrude Bastille Moselle, who was the third generation of women activists, who was a women's suffrage person, there are actually more than 300 Black women listed in the women suffrage, online suffrage records, their works and other things. So the 1913 march was very important because Alice Paul and the leaders wanted Black women to march at the end of the line, and Ida B. Wells absolutely refused to do that and joined the Illinois procession. And so they actually were the generation that handed things off. And I think most people now know via exhibits that not only did not Black women get the full right to vote, although they tried to vote in 1920 in Florida and in Richmond and Virginia and other places. Also, Native women weren't able to vote. Women in Puerto Rico and Asian immigrant women weren't able to vote for many, many years. So the Voting Rights Act was important for women of color, not just Black women. So the two anniversaries are critical to women getting all American women getting the right to vote. And unfortunately, there also, the Voting Rights Act has been gutted. So I'm gonna let our law professor and our civic engagement professor talk about those things.
Perfect. And before we dig into the law and unpack really how it has been used to reinforce a lot of this stalled or delayed enfranchisement, I want to talk to Dr. Banet-Weiser briefly about this role, this duality of popular feminism and popular misogyny existing side by side. As Professor Joseph opened us up, he mentioned that many of the male journalists of the time did not approve of what the women suffragettes were doing. And in your book, you speak so well about how every time women come up with some kind of movement, there is a backlash from men. Can you talk a little bit more about how that works and how in this context it really stymied women's progress for a long time?
Sure, and hi everyone, and just echoing Francille, it's really, really nice to be here, and thanks for organizing this, Allissa, and it's nice to be back at Annenberg. So I think that Francille just laid out, and Channing earlier laid out the, some of the kind of complexities of the differences in what it meant to be a white woman or a woman of color or a Black woman during suffrage. And that was clearly, any time that you have feminism kind of achieving a sort of heightened visibility, you have this sort of cleavage between, this what Allissa had said earlier, a kind of wedge between white feminists and Black feminists, and suffrage and abolition was one moment, the civil rights movement and the second wave feminism was another feminist movement in the mid 20th century was another one. The Me Too movement, which became highly visible when a white celebrity tweeted it out, kind of eclipsing, at least initially, the fact that an African-American activist, Tarana Burke, was the one who had actually created the movement of Me Too. So the kind of the tensions around race and structural racism and the ways in which white feminists refused to take an intersectional perspective, and throughout history is one of the tensions, I think, in the suffrage movement. Another one, as you said, Allissa, was the fact that, anytime something, anytime any mainstream or non-mainstream feminist movement gets a little bit of visibility in the media and culture and the news, you have a very predictable backlash. And the suffrage movement was no different. So I'm a media studies professor, so I look at media and I've thought about the suffrage movement in terms of the kinds of media that suffragettes produced. And so, some of them were these kind of posters that featured white women as very virtuous and moral kind of protectors of the nation. So if I could just see the first slide. So you can see here, these different, this kind of very nationalist outfits and this idea of this kind of virtue and a morality for the suffragettes. Well, again, as Francille gestured towards, that virtue and morality also took a different turn when in the middle of Jim Crow racism, when white women also positioned their whiteness as justifications for lynchings during that moment. And so these kind of ideas about virtue and morality get twisted. And many men and a sort of misogynist, structural misogyny also twisted them. And so when suffragettes began to campaign for the vote, you had also in media and posters and signs, you had a harsh backlash, one that seems very familiar. So if I could see the next slide. So you have all sorts of kind of very typical stereotypes about women who dare to speak or use their voice, or you just want to use their voice in a public domain. Women's places in her home, the babies children were always a big part of this backlash. Nobody loves me. My mother's out being a suffragette. I want to vote, but my wife won't let me. So all of these stereotypes that we see in the media about emasculating men, man-hating feminists, and women who don't care about their children, who are angry, all of those were kind of used by misogynistic and patriarchal culture as a way to, again, kind of imply a certain morality and virtue to women. But this time it was distorted, and it was, the kind of gesture was that women their moral duty was to be in the home. Their moral duty was to take care of children, and certainly not to use their voices in the public sphere. So you can see this kind of relationship, like you said, Allissa, between popular feminism, anytime feminism becomes visible, and a misogynistic backlash. And they're always entwined in a relationship, as much as, kind of whiteness in terms of white mainstream feminism and Black feminists and feminists of colors are also always entwined in a relationship that is reactive to each other.
Wow, it's an amazing analysis. And I really love that, because it helps us talk about another unholy alliance, right? Just like we have this real tension, as you described it, between this unwillingness to look at feminism in an intersectional way, there's also been historically a tension between journalism and justice, right? Journalism has always done the bidding of these kinds of laws. It's kind of undergirded or supported popular ideas about women and why women shouldn't deserve the right to vote. And so I want to talk a bit about that with you, Dr. Gross. How has law been weaponized in many cases to enforce some of the ideas that media tried to put forward at the end of the 19th century, top of the 20th century? Because I love in your book that becoming free and becoming Black are processes, right? And they're legal processes. So can you kind of give us the legal undergirding here? How has this stalled enfranchisement of women been upheld by the law?
Unmute. I just want to say thank you for including me on this really interesting panel. And I'll say two things. Becoming Free, Becoming Black is a book that's looking at the establishment of racial regimes in the law from the earliest times, really before the end of slavery. So we compared Virginia and Louisiana to Cuba. And the key difference we found, although in all three places from the earliest moments of European colonists coming to the Americas and engaging in the slave trade, they were setting racial distinctions into law and creating associations between Blackness and a degraded status, fitness for enslavement, and whiteness and freedom. But the real distinction that we saw developing over time, and we look at a really long, from the 16th century to the end of slavery, the real distinction we see developing is that it's actually in the US, in a republic that's supposed to be supposedly based on these ideals of equality and freedom and democracy, that citizenship becomes really tied in the law to whiteness. That at the moment in the early 19th century, in the early republic, when the franchise is being expanded to all white men, when they're getting rid of property restrictions and saying, every white man can participate in democracy, that's the moment when you see a movement to remove free people of color from the United States, to say it would be impossible for even a free Black man to be a citizen. And at that moment, they're not even talking about women yet. But that tight association between citizenship and whiteness in the law is one that really carries forward after emancipation. And so even after the passage of the 15th Amendment that supposedly gives Black men the right to vote, we know that that there are a host of ways, both extra legal and legal, to prevent people from voting. So many of these are familiar to us. The poll tax, right? Again, introducing the idea that you have to pay to vote, literacy tests, understanding tests where someone might have to come in and read and explain a passage of the Constitution to the discretion of the voter registrar who's sitting there saying, no, that's not good enough. The term grandfather, you're grandfathered in, is literally from constitutional clauses saying that if your grandfather was a citizen, you're a citizen. So that poor white people wouldn't have to show their understanding or literacy, only free Black people. I mention all of these because, as my colleague Francille Wilson alluded to, we are seeing a resurgence of so many of these disfranchisement mechanisms today that we thought were an artifact of the late 19th century, that were aimed at keeping Black people from voting. At the time, even before there was a possibility that women could vote, they were aimed at keeping Black men from voting. And after the decision of the Supreme Court in Shelby County versus Holder in 2013, which kind of gutted the protections in the Voting Rights Act that had been aimed at states where we know there was discrimination, all of those states have put back in. Many of these, again, are familiar: voter ID laws, purging voter rolls, making it impossible for people to vote early, a variety of kinds of felon disfranchisement, right? We know in some places maybe you can't vote when you're in prison, but when you have served your time, you can vote again. Other states now say you can't vote for life. You're stripped of your vote for life. All of those are echoes of late 19th century ways to disfranchise Black voters. And I just want to say reflect for a moment on the activism that we've been talking about in terms of women like Ida B. Wells. So one of the things Ida B. Wells focused on for a lot of her career was opposition to lynching, and she toured Europe, and she wrote, she got herself kicked out of her hometown for publishing exposés in her newspaper. She was incredibly courageous. She recognized that the excuse for lynching, that the threadbare lie that was being told, was one about a myth of rape or some kind of sexual hysteria to justify terrible violence and murder. But she understood that it was political and economic power that lynchers were aiming for, that they were keeping, that disfranchisement was their larger goal, that terror was a weapon to disfranchise people. And it went hand in hand with the legal, you could have the legal mechanisms on one hand, the violence on the other. And the one, kind of ray of, I completely agree with Professor Banet-Weiser's kind of dim view of many of those white suffragists. I think Elizabeth Cady Stanton's probably the worst, but there were some allies in the battle against lynching, and it was really key when Jessie Daniel Ames formed the Association of Southern Women, that meant white women, for the prevention of lynching, that there be white Southern women who stood up and said, we don't need our womanhood protected this way. This isn't about protecting our womanhood. And that was a very effective form of political advocacy and national attention to lynching. So there's some hope or precedent for the possibility of allyship there.
That's incredible. And as I was listening to you and thinking about all of the different legal ways that these things have been enforced, it doesn't escape me that those things are coming back. And as you stated, a lot of those tools are being brought back in terms of purging these voter rolls, these different ways of discouraging people from getting to the polls. And Dr. Romero, I want to pull you in here. What kind of long-term effects do these kinds of legal policies have on political and voter underrepresentation? Because I know that's one of the things that you study most, is why people don't come out, why they've been discouraged to, and what can encourage them to try to exercise their right to vote when so much is put in their way. So let's talk a little bit about what are some of the modern hindrances that you've found and how we can possibly overcome them.
Sure. Important question. And first, I would like to let folks know that I direct the Center for Inclusive Democracy at USC, formerly called the California Civic Engagement Project. We recently changed our name, so for folks that might be Googling. So if I may, let me just start with some numbers, because I think that's important, right? So first off, we need to talk about where we're at in terms of the struggle. So for women overall, now and for quite a long time, we have seen higher turnout rates among women compared to men. In 2016, the most recent general election, overall women had a higher turnout rate by about 4 percentage points than men did. If we break that out, though, by race, ethnicity, age, we see some significant differences. And I'll just talk about age for a moment. So what's really driving that 4 percentage point difference, that gender gap in turnout, if you will, are younger women. So they have a larger gap between, so under 45, 18 to 24, 25 to 34, the gap between in turnout between men and women is larger. For much older women, not old women, but just older women, 65 plus and 75 plus, there is the gap actually reverses, and older men vote in higher numbers than women do. So something for our mother's generation, right, to be talking about. But if we break it out by race, ethnicity, and age, so younger women are driving that turnout gap between men and women, younger generations. And then if we break it out by race, ethnicity, the gap between women and men, young women and young men, is much larger for women of color, particularly Latinas and African American women versus their male counterparts. So I just want to state that, because that's it's concerning to see a gap for young men of color not voting as much, but also we want to give credit, right, for our young women that are out there that are driving higher turnout rates, or at least driving turnout rates. So that being said, now let's talk about just overall disparities by race, ethnicity for women. So white women are overrepresented amongst the women's vote, period. And that's because of the disparities among white or between white women and women of color when it comes to turnout. So again, just thinking about the 2016 general election, there was a 17, I'm trying to remember now and make sure that I've got that right, because it's so, 17 percentage points difference between, forgetting age, just Latinas period and white women period, between the Latina turnout in that election and the turnout of white women, 17 percentage points. For African American women, much smaller, but still present, so about 3 percentage points difference. And that's a general election. Typically, we see gaps, period, disparities by race, ethnicity increase when we talk about midterms. But since we're going into a general, I'm talking about general numbers. So there's a lot of conversation about, for African American women and the African American vote, but particularly for women, that there's been so much improvement, and African American women are a powerhouse, and they're helping to drive the overall African American vote. But there are still disparities that remain, right? So when we talk about the promise of women's suffrage, still to this day, we have quite significant differences by age and by race and ethnicity, and meaning we have a lot of work still to do. Now that being said, just really quickly, and I'm happy to talk about this again later in another question, but what can we do about it? So aside from breaking open the historical patterns, right, that have led to an uneven playing field, if you will, I'll just talk about in terms of like in the immediate. we know that women, particularly women of color, because of their lower turnout rates, are less likely to get outreach and mobilization from campaigns. They're seen as not likely voters, or at least less likely voters. And in any given, for instance, for Latinas, and in the last several election cycles, as national surveys have been done of registered Latinas, we know that over half, some of this work's been done by Naleo, over half will report not getting any outreach from a campaign or even an advocacy group or community group asking them to come out and turn out to vote. And these are registered Latinas, right? So they're already on the radar in the fact that they're registered. So, outreach and mobilization is absolutely key. Everybody needs to be asked to vote. And we know that because of the way campaigns and candidates work, they reach out to those that they feel are most likely, the biggest bang for their buck in terms of their investment in a campaign. They rely often on models that are designed with the end product of disproportionately disadvantaging women of color particularly. Now, that being said, I want to just also be clear, when I said younger women were driving the turnout gap, younger women still have much lower turnout rates than older women, right? But they're kind of carrying their weight more so even, if you will, I hate that term, than younger men. And we just we still need to support them because they should have higher turnout rates, but they're at least, driving turnout amongst younger age groups, for Latinas, for African American, for Asian American, and so forth. The gender gap kind of varies for Asian Americans, so that's why I didn't get into those details as well. I will leave it there, but I think it's just really imperative that we understand where we're coming from, and understand those numbers and understand just how big those gaps are. They persist, they are entrenched. And there's much work that needs to be done and many resources that need to be gathered in a given campaign election cycle, but also in between election cycles to encourage young women, women of color, period, to be out there, having their voice heard, and to be fully supported in those actions.
I'm so glad you brought that up because last night, as you know, was the first night of the DNC, and to see it hosted by Eva Longoria was really something to observe that younger voters are being appealed to in that way, and specifically these gaps that you're talking about in terms of the Latinx vote being imperative during this time was on full display. I'm going to move to some of our questions here. We have a few coming in from the audience. I want to remind everybody to use your Q&A feature if you want to pose a question. The first one says, I have routinely heard that women voters do not necessarily vote for women candidates for office. What is the truth, please? Who would like to take that?
Well,
maybe the last presidential cycle. I'm not sure what context, state or national, but.
I can jump in. So I think maybe implied in that, and I'm probably not the intent of the person asking the question, but is that women should automatically vote for women. So just as, I'll get this question, we do a lot of research on the Latino vote, and we'll get a question of, is it kind of automatic if you have a Latino on the ballot, aren't Latinos going to vote for them, or why wouldn't they? So women, like hopefully, any group, we're looking for good candidates, right, that are qualified, that match the values and needs of themselves, or their families, their communities, and certainly, I think starting with a woman on the ballot is incredibly important. One thing I talked about underrepresentation in voting. We didn't talk about underrepresentation in elected office, right? And having women be part of the decision-making process, and women are still very much underrepresented amongst elected officials. Look at Congress. Look at the Senate. We are smart and we are savvy, and we are looking for policies, right, and similar values and lived experiences. And often a female candidate for a woman, right, will get their attention because it's more likely that they'll have similar lived experiences, and maybe particularly a woman from the same racial ethnic background. But they may get our attention, but we also still do the work to make sure that that candidate actually is representing our interests and needs. So I'll just say that.
Right, it's not a given, right?
It's not a given, and quite frankly, it's not a compliment, right, to expect a woman to simply vote. And then again, I'm not sure that wasn't the intent of the question. Women voters are I think actually there's some work to suggest we'll spend more time. They'll get less outreach and education, but when they or mobilization, but the work that they do, either on their own or when they are mobilized, they'll spend more time to research, to really think critically about that candidate or that issue or that ballot measure, and they can be it's a vote that needs to be earned.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Okay. This next question is for Dr. Banet-Weiser. How do you think this conversation about popular feminism in political contexts and the misogynist backlash plays into the current moment with the 2020 presidential race and Senator Harris announced as Biden's VP? We're already starting to see some misogynistic ads come out, some racist ads. And I believe this question speaks to what should we make of this? How do we unpack that?
Yeah, it's a great it's a great question, and I think that there's sort of there. I think we actually have normalized the idea that in the United States there has never been a female president, and that just seems like, oh, there's just never been one. Whereas in everywhere else in the world there has been one, and so we have to kind of think about what is the backlash to having a woman in a position of power, in a public position of power, where she might have some impact on things like laws and policies and changing structures. And so it's really depressing. Ariel, I don't want to be always the dim voice here, but when you study misogyny, it's usually not like a walk in the park, but Trump routinely uses misogynistic epithets to talk about every woman that dares to have a voice that is somehow challenges his. And we saw this like incredible speech by AOC the other, a week ago or so, when she was called, an effing bitch, by a fellow senator, and how that becomes normalized. So if you have so it doesn't, the question is about Harris and what, whether or not the misogynistic backlash will happen. It's already happening. It will continue to happen. And I think that, she is an incredibly smart, very self-possessed candidate who will challenge it. But, I think we need to think about how it is as a culture. We need to refuse this kind of, constant framing of any woman who dares to, come out into the public space or dares to occupy a position of power. We need to challenge the fact that she's constantly framed in these misogynistic terms instead of, and that's why I thought AOC's speech was so powerful, because she said, you know what, this happens to me all the time. I was going to let it go. But once he used his wife and his daughter as a justification for, what kind of man he was, she kind of really pushed back. And I think that those kinds of statements we need to be making more of. They're hard to make because misogyny is incredibly powerful and damaging and traumatic, So I hope that addresses the question. I mean, I think, again, that we're going to see more of it. We saw it with Clinton. We see it with every female candidate. And we just have to figure out a way as a culture, as a collectivity, to continue to refuse it and resist it and not allow it to become normalized in the way that we speak about women in public, in public offices and public spaces.
Yeah, it's a great point. And one of the questions that's just come in speaks to that. It suggests that, or ask, I guess, for Dr. Wilson, of this history of Frederick Douglass. It says he was canonized in the introduction, but abandoned his alliance with the women's suffrage movement in 1869 with regard to the language in the 15th Amendment. This question comes as a, I guess, half statement, half comment, and wants to know more about why he kind of withdrew his support, and if that happened in history.
Well, and Professor Gross can also talk about this as well, but Frederick Douglass never gave up on women's suffrage. And that's just period stop. And in fact, the last day of his life, he went to, in 1893, he went to a women's suffrage meeting and urged Black women who were quite miffed with the National Women's Suffrage Organization for their racism to attend the meeting as well. And he went and, you know, spoke to the Black women that were there and said, you know, to the other ones that they had to keep up the fight. What Frederick Douglass was saying about the 15th Amendment was that politically, it was not going to be possible to have race and sex, or race and gender, in that amendment, and that Black people needed to have, the Black men needed to have the vote to protect their lives and their families. And of course, Sojourner Truth and other people disagree with this, but this is the beginning of the split. The split doesn't happen because of Black people. It happens because then the real racism starts coming out on the women's suffrage side, and there's some class issues. In fact, in the Black community, women and children had, as Elsa Barkley Brown has written about, had the right to vote, had voice and vote in their churches and in their state constitutional meetings that happened during Reconstruction. So he was never against women voting. You could say that it was a practical thing, but it's almost impossible to think about what would have happened without the 15th Amendment, or if we had the 19th Amendment without the 15th Amendment, likely Black people still wouldn't be able to vote today.
And speaking of today, another great question has just come in. Thank you for that, Dr. Wilson. It says, what did you make of the president announcing today that he would issue a pardon to Susan B. Anthony? She was convicted for the crime of voting in 1872 and clearly did not want a future pardon. Is this an effective political stunt or an insult? Who wants to take that?
Well, it's hard not to see it as a political stunt. You know, if President Trump were so concerned about the protecting the right to vote, he could save the post office and guarantee that we could have a safe and fair election instead of trying to sabotage voting rights. So I think that would be more meaningful than the posthumous pardon to Susan B. Anthony, who I think paid a fine. It was trivial.
Yeah, you have some students who are here in the chat too, and they're nervous about that. One says, I'm nervous that the remote semester might impact voter turnout for new voters, college students. How can USC or other schools inspire voting, especially during this time of this mail-in kind of fraud building?
I just have one suggestion of just really simple thing that I hope that all employers, including USC, which is the biggest employer in Los Angeles, will do is give their workers time off to vote, especially in places where people do have to vote, or most people will end up having to vote in person and might be waiting a long, long time. They should be able to take off the day to go vote. And college students, similarly, we should all make sure that, we give our students that time. That's the number one thing everybody should be doing on November 3rd.
Mm-hmm. Add to that, Dr. Romero?
Yeah, it's incredibly important that universities support students in voting. And what does that look like? Really helping to create a culture of voting. This election, every registered voter in California will get a vote by mail ballot mailed to them because of COVID. But still, young people age 18 to 24, we know this from our research and other research that's been done on this topic, are less likely than older groups to use that vote by mail ballot. They have to be encouraged, and there's a lot of uncertainty. How do you use it? What is the process? And young people, at least initially in those really early years after turning 18, want to go down in person and vote, which is still an option in LA and very much across the state. So I think creating that culture, prioritizing the importance of voting, bringing on a campus, well, and it's a little hard in the time of COVID, but in other ways, bringing issues and ideas and speakers to students to get them engaged and to make that connection. Young people care very much about the world around them and about issues that matter to them and their community and their families and their peers. But some don't vote because it's hard for them to make that transition to why voting itself is an actionable step on something they care about, on an issue they care about. And in any way that our campus can do that and other campuses can do that, I think is just really critically important in helping young people to register first also. Although we also have same-day voter registration, advertising, getting out the vote, getting out information around how they can vote, how they can register, and the specifics of this election is really important. And campuses have a unique connection automatically with students to be able to share that information and encourage them to participate.
Great, and perhaps you might be the best person to answer this next question too. What are the racial justice and intersectional feminists voters looking for in this election, and how can we all help make sure that everyone still maintains their right to vote considering those issues? So what is the core platform? We've been talking a lot about what this all looks like in a modern context. I think some questions that are coming in are like, should I know in my state what's happening? Like, how do I know in my state that voter rolls are being purged? Or where do I go to find out information about possible things that are happening now to prohibit people from voting? And what can I do if I am an intersectional feminist or a racial justice warrior to fight those things? How can people get involved?
I'll let my fellow panelists jump in first if they have a thought.
Well, I think that there are a number of organizations, and I also think that this is a moment that many social justice and intersectional feminists and people in the LGBTQ community are concerned about both Republican and Democratic Party platforms. And I think this is the moment to urge people not to stay home and to look at the downstream candidates, because when you are just focused on the presidential candidates, you forget that there may be, and there certainly are, many other very important races, from the sheriff, the county district attorney, the school board, and to work on those. And there are a number of other things like Fair Fight Action, which is Stacey Abrams' organization that has information, Black Youth 100. There are a number of other organizations that have been keeping up. Because we do things by state, it is difficult, but there are some things online that you can find what the voting rules are, what the rules by state and even by county, what the rules are about how you have to turn in the ballots, whether you can go and whether you have to take it yourself if you don't mail it. And those rules are very different, and you should never just give your ballot to somebody who says they're going to take it in, because it's likely that is a scam. So we just really need to do much more civic education about voting, and have people take their kids to the polls with them. I think when you read about voters, many people talk about having gone to the polls with their parents as very young children, and those people are much more likely to vote. I know that I did that with my mom growing up in segregated St. Louis County, and so it was just no question that I would vote. And I tell students, you just need to vote, because even if you vote, if you decide later that the candidate wasn't right, you can argue about it, but you don't have the right to argue about the outcomes if you didn't participate at all. And I voted for the Peace and Freedom Party the first time I could vote, and that was stupid. But we can all have one stupid election.
Allissa, could I just
please.
just quickly, oh, sorry, Mindy. Oh, sorry. And I was just going to quickly echo what Francille just said. I think that it's often really hard to motivate college students, to convince college students that two white men in their 70s represent them and their interests. And so, despite all of the media that's surrounded about getting the youth vote, I think that an emphasis on local politics is something that we don't do enough of. And it is local politics, like we've said, like state by state, that actually impacts young people's lives in very concrete ways. And there's not enough information and not enough mobilization around kind of local issues and the historical ones, like we've been pointing out today, how these different historical frameworks have allowed and enabled some groups to vote and not others. And that's happening again today. So to making those connections, I think, for young people is really important on a very local level.
And Dr. Romero, did you want to weigh in? Thank you.
Well, I see we're at 1 o'clock, so I'll just echo everything everyone said. The last thing I want, just maybe one quick thing. I think it's so important when we're talking specifically about young people and young women. Again, overall, even though women help drive the gender gap amongst younger voters, especially women of color, 18 to 24-year-olds have much lower turnout rates than older groups, right? And we can't think of it as being because of apathy. It's not because of apathy. Every age group has those voters that are apathetic, yes, certainly. But it is, as I said earlier, young people care very much. They are not considered likely voters. They are very unlikely, even when registered, to get campaign information and to be outreached to and to be mobilized. And then they look in the world around them and they see two candidates that don't seem to represent their interests. They don't hear often issues that seem to matter to them in their community. And it's actually quite logical. We give them a pathetic civics education with some wonderful exceptions, of course, in dedicated teachers, but overall pathetic civics education system in our country and in our state here. And they turn 18 and we magically expect them to both know how to vote and to want to vote, to be motivated to vote. And when they don't vote, we blame it on them and say, what's wrong with our young generation? So we really need to have a commitment in our society. I don't have time to get into all of the things we should be doing, but certainly a college campus is a place, right? And anyone connected here on this call to reach out to our young people to support them. And the local really does matter. It's really hard when you have such a heated presidential election that kind of sucks the air out of the room, and what we do have of our media kind of goes towards that, and it's even more challenging for young people less familiar with how to get information and to kind of sift through the noise of campaigns to be able to hear about the local. So we need to support them and respect them in the journey, right, to become voters, but to help them get that information and to encourage them as much as possible in that process. And that was more than a minute, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Dr. Romero. I think this has been an incredible conversation. You all provided a great historic art to this and really delved into why this day has so many layers, right? It's not just a celebration, but it is really a call to action that we continue this work. And I'm just glad that I can talk to all of you about this from all your different disciplines. This conversation has enriched me, and I hope it has enriched you too as audience members. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of your questions, but I feel like we got really great ones in, and I'm grateful that we're able to have this conversation today at SC. So thank you, and I hope that you all stay tuned with all of the news that's coming up until November. Just stay awake and make sure that you exercise your right to vote, because so many fought hard for it.